I hadn't expected much from the day. In fact, it felt like every other, dull, predictable, and routine. Wake up, open my antique shop, find ways to pass the time. That had been my life for the past several years. Loneliness wasn't something loud or dramatic for me. It was a quiet, creeping thing, the kind that settled in when you least expected it, like in the middle of a grocery store aisle. That's where it happened. Walmart, of all places. I was moving through the store, picking up the usual essentials, my mind drifting as my hands worked on autopilot. The shelves stacked with cereal boxes and discount cleaning supplies barely registered in my thoughts. It wasn't that I was unhappy, just alone. I had been alone ever since Mark left. 7 years ago he walked out of my life, and though they called it divorce, it felt more like he had simply disappeared. One day, we were partners, and the next, we were strangers. Time, as it always does, moved forward, and I moved along with it. At 57, the world seemed to expect me to be settled, to accept whatever fate had decided for me. But then he appeared. At first, he was just the cashier, the guy scanning my groceries. I didn't know his name yet, but he was impossible to ignore. Tall, probably around 6 feet 3 inches, with lean muscles that stretched against the fabric of his uniform just right. His messy, tousled curls framed a face that looked as though it had been sculpted by Michelangelo himself, strong, defined, with a jawline sharp enough to cut glass, and his eyes, piercing green, the kind that seemed to see straight through a person, but it was his smile that did it, that smile. "Ma'am, you all right?" The deep, velvety tone of his voice snapped me out of the trance I hadn't even realized I was in. My breath hitched as I blinked, suddenly aware that I had been staring, probably for far too long. "Oh, sorry," I muttered, my face heating as I quickly averted my gaze, pretending to be utterly fascinated by the cereal boxes in my cart. He chuckled, a soft, amused sound, before continuing to scan my items. "No worries. Happens all the time." I glanced up at him from beneath my lashes, my pulse quickening. I had never considered myself a shy woman, but something about him made me feel like a flustered schoolgirl. Heat bloomed across my skin, and I stole another look at him. God, he was gorgeous. That youthful confidence, that effortless charm, it radiated off him. And here I was, a middle-aged woman with graying roots, feeling things I hadn't felt in years. My fingers fumbled with my wallet as he finished bagging my groceries. My mind, however, was betraying me, running rampant with thoughts I hadn't entertained in a long time. His hands, his touch, the firm strength of his body. A sudden warmth spread through me, both exhilarating and mortifying. I did something I never usually did. I slid a tip along with my payment, just $5, but it felt necessary. A small gesture, something to acknowledge whatever had just passed between us. "Thanks," he said, his gaze locking onto mine for a beat longer than it needed to. A flicker of something ignited deep within me. Desire, want, need. I swallowed hard, mumbling a barely coherent response before gathering my bags and practically rushing out of the store. The moment the cool evening breeze hit my face, I expected the fire inside me to subside. It didn't. My hands gripped the steering wheel as I climbed into my car, taking a steadying breath. Get a hold of yourself, Juliet. But no matter how hard I tried to push the thoughts away, they clung to me. His face, his voice, the way his hands moved with effortless precision. I couldn't shake it. By the time I got home, I was a mess. I attempted to distract myself with television, but it was useless. My thoughts kept drifting back to him. Asher. I didn't even know his name yet, but he had taken root in my mind, invading every idle moment. And suddenly, I wasn't just 57 anymore. I wasn't a widow, a woman past her prime. I was just a woman with desires, ones that had been buried so deep I had almost forgotten they existed. Before I knew it, I was upstairs in my bedroom, the grocery bags still abandoned on the kitchen counter. I lay back on my bed staring at the ceiling, but in my mind, I wasn't alone. He was there. It had been so long since I had allowed myself this kind of indulgence, but tonight, I didn't care. My body ached with something unfamiliar yet deeply known. I let my fingers trace down my skin, imagining they were his. The way he looked, the way he moved, effortlessly, confidently, it consumed me. And before I could stop myself, I whispered his name under my breath. What was I doing? This wasn't me. I was a grown woman, for God's sake, not some infatuated teenager. But the more I tried to reason with myself, the more I wanted him. I craved him. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw him. I heard his voice. I felt his presence. It was maddening. Normally, I only did my grocery shopping twice a month. No need to go more often, but suddenly I found excuses, any excuse, to return to Walmart. Eggs, coffee, a fresh pack of fruit, detergent. It didn't matter what I needed, as long as it brought me back to him. Days passed in a blur, and with each trip, I felt ridiculous, obsessed over a man half my age. But I didn't care. Just seeing him, exchanging a smile, hearing him speak, it awakened something in me. Something I hadn't felt in a long, long time. Then, one day, everything changed. It was late afternoon, another quiet day at the antique shop. I had told myself I wasn't going to Walmart. I didn't need anything. But by 4 o'clock, my hands were itching. Before I could stop myself, I was already in the car, driving. As I walked through the sliding doors, my heart hammered. There he was, at the far register, ringing up another customer. The store was nearly empty, just a handful of shoppers scattered through the aisles. I grabbed random things off the shelves, things I didn't need, just to justify being there, just to see him. I couldn't stop myself from stealing glances at him. Asher looked especially good that evening, his curls slightly messier, as if he'd been running his fingers through them all day. He moved with that effortless grace, every shift of his lean body smooth and fluid. The t-shirt he wore clung just enough, outlining the definition of his chest and arms in a way that was impossible to ignore. By the time I reached the checkout, the store had nearly emptied. I placed my few items on the belt, a bunch of bananas, a bag of chips, another bottle of wine, trying my best to appear casual. But every time his fingers brushed against the groceries, a familiar warmth unfurled deep inside me, spreading through my body like a slow-burning ember. As he handed me the receipt, I noticed his gaze flicker toward the clock hanging behind him. The register drawer closed with a heavy clunk, followed by a soft sigh of relief. "You're my last customer," he said, flashing that easy, boyish smile. His voice was warm, familiar, like the last sip of something strong on a cold night. "Finally get to head out." I nodded, my pulse quickening with an unfamiliar anticipation. A reckless thought formed in my mind, something daring and completely unlike me. Before I could stop myself, I was acting on it. Asher gathered his things and started toward the exit, and I trailed behind, pretending to rummage through my purse. This was my chance. Outside, the sky had darkened, and the streetlights buzzed to life overhead. Asher walked toward the parking lot, his keys jangling in his hand. Keeping a short distance between us, I scanned the rows of cars, spotting mine just a few feet away. Without hesitating, I leaned over the hood and popped it open, feigning concern as I peered into the engine. Now or never. "This thing won't start," I muttered, just loud enough for him to hear. As I had hoped, he slowed, turning to glance over his shoulder. "You okay, ma'am?" His voice carried a genuine concern, his brows knitting together slightly. I let out an exasperated sigh, crossing my arms. "It's my car. Been acting up all week and now it won't start." I huffed in frustration, playing the part perfectly. Asher tilted his head, considering for a moment before stepping closer. "Mind if I take a look?" "Yes, please, I'd really appreciate that." Even in the openness of the parking lot, his presence was overwhelming. I stepped aside as he leaned over the engine, his curls falling over his forehead, his fingers tracing over the wires and pipes with quiet focus. I watched shamelessly, my eyes lingering on the way his muscles flexed beneath his t-shirt, the way he carried himself with effortless confidence. After a moment, he straightened up, wiping his hands on his jeans. "I know a guy who can tow it and get it fixed. No worries." A breath of relief escaped me. "Thank you, Asher. I had no idea what I was going to do." He smiled, and for a moment, the world felt just a little brighter. "I can give you a ride home if you'd like," he offered, nodding toward his car. "I'm parked right over there." The words were out before I could stop them. That would be wonderful. Asher led me to his car, a sleek black sedan with leather seats. He opened the passenger door for me, and as I slid inside, I was immediately wrapped in the scent of leather and the faint, intoxicating trace of his cologne. As he drove, we exchanged light conversation, small talk about the weather, his job, my antique shop. But my mind was elsewhere, spinning with thoughts, with possibilities, with desires I had buried for far too long. When we finally pulled into my driveway, I turned to him, my heart pounding. This was it. "Would you like to come in for a drink?" I asked, keeping my tone casual, though my insides were anything but. For the briefest second he hesitated, his hands still resting on the wheel. Then, with that same irresistible smile, he nodded. "Sure, why not?" Inside, I gestured toward the living room. "Make yourself comfortable. I'll grab us some beers." Asher sank into the couch, looking around with mild curiosity while I disappeared into the kitchen. My hands trembled slightly as I pulled 2 cold bottles from the fridge. I exhaled, steadying myself before returning and handing him one. "Hope you like lagers," I said with a smile. "Perfect," he murmured, effortlessly popping the cap off with a flick of his thumb. He leaned back into the cushions, sipping his beer, looking so relaxed, so at ease. And yet, I wanted more. I wanted him to look at me, not in a friendly way, but in the way I had imagined countless nights since I first saw him. Excusing myself, I slipped away to my bedroom, the unopened beer still cool in my grip. Standing before the mirror in the dim light, I hesitated only for a second before reaching for my silk robe, the one that hugged in all the right places, revealing just enough to tempt but not enough to give everything away. It wasn't modest, but modesty wasn't what I was after tonight. I let the fabric drape over my shoulders, tying the sash loosely so it hung open just enough to hint at what lay beneath. Tonight, I wasn't Juliet, the middle-aged woman. Tonight, I was simply a woman. When I returned to the living room, Asher was still sipping his beer, his gaze fixed on the television. I strolled in casually, pretending not to notice him watching me. "Where's that remote?" I muttered, leaning forward to search beneath the coffee table. As I moved, the robe slipped slightly, revealing a glimpse of bare skin. From the corner of my eye, I caught it, that quick flicker, the way his gaze shifted toward me before he snapped his eyes back to the screen. I straightened, remote in hand, flashing him a knowing smile. "Got it." Asher cleared his throat, shifting slightly. "Nice place you've got." "Thank you," I murmured, sinking onto the couch beside him. Not too close, but close enough that our legs brushed. "So," I said, keeping my voice light, teasing, "do you always go out of your way to help old ladies with their cars?" Asher chuckled, running a hand through his curls. "Only the ones who tip well." I laughed, surprised at how genuine the sound was. God, he was charming, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt desirable. Like maybe, just maybe, this beautiful young man didn't just see me as an aging woman. We sat in silence for a moment, sipping our beers, but the air between us had shifted. Something electric, something thrilling and dangerous, simmered beneath the surface. Asher moved slightly, his thigh brushing against mine again. This time he didn't pull away. I turned to him, my heart hammering in my chest, and smiled. "Thank you for the ride, Asher," I whispered, letting my fingers rest lightly on his arm. "It's been a while since I've had company." He looked at me then, really looked at me, and for that one moment, time stood still. "You're welcome," he murmured, his voice low, uncertain, and in that moment, I knew this was my moment. Asher's gaze lingered on me, uncertain, yet intrigued. My heart pounded against my ribs as I let my fingers trail slowly, deliberately, down his arm. I saw it, the way his breath hitched, subtle but telling. He felt something. He shifted slightly on the couch, his body tensing with an energy that was neither fear nor resistance. I leaned in just a little more, letting the silk robe slip, exposing just enough to tempt. "You don't have to leave just yet," I whispered, my voice barely more than a breath between us. Asher swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing as he looked at me. There was hesitation in his eyes, a silent war between logic and instinct, between what was right and what he wanted. And God, I hoped he wanted me. "Juliet," he started, his voice low, uncertain. I reached up, pressing a single finger against his lips, silencing him with the lightest touch. "Just stay," I whispered, a soft, knowing smile playing on my lips. "A little while longer." When I pulled my hand away, he didn't move. He just sat there, watching me, waiting. The space between us felt smaller now, charged with something electric, something inevitable. Slowly, I reached for his beer, setting it on the coffee table without breaking eye contact. Then I shifted closer, my body humming with anticipation. His scent filled my senses, fresh pine, crisp laundry, and something else, something warm and familiar, something that felt like home. It made my head swim. Lifting my hand, I brushed a stray curl from his forehead, letting my fingers linger for a second longer than necessary. He inhaled sharply, and this time I saw the shift in his expression. It wasn't just hesitation anymore. It was curiosity, desire, the flicker of something deeper, something neither of us wanted to name but both of us felt. I leaned in, my lips grazing his cheek in the lightest, slowest touch. His stubble was soft beneath my lips, rough in just the right way. I felt the tension coil in him, his breath stalling in his chest. But then, as if surrendering, he exhaled, and I felt the moment settle between us. "You're so handsome," I whispered against his skin. It wasn't a lie. He was breathtaking, like something sculpted from marble, but warmer, real. Asher turned his head slightly, and suddenly our faces were mere inches apart. I hesitated, just for a second, giving him a chance to pull away, a chance to stop this before it became something neither of us could take back. But he didn't. Instead, his lips parted, his eyes searching mine for something unspoken, and then he moved, closing the space, mirroring my movements as if something inside him had finally given in. His hand found the small of my back, strong yet gentle. The robe slipped further open, but I didn't adjust it. I didn't need to. I wanted him to see me, to understand that I wasn't just a woman from another generation, a name on a customer receipt. I was alive. And I had been waiting for this, for him, for longer than I cared to admit. Breaking away slightly, I rested my forehead against his, my breath uneven. "Asher," I whispered, emotion threading through my voice. "I've been waiting for a moment like this for so long. I want you to know how much I care about you. I want to feel close to you." That was all the encouragement he needed. With a quiet resolve, he wrapped his arms around me, lifting me effortlessly from the couch. The world around us faded, the space shrinking to just the two of us. Two bodies caught in something undeniable, something neither of us wanted to resist anymore. Asher pulled back for the briefest moment, his gaze locking onto mine, as if giving me one last chance to change my mind. But I didn't. Instead, I smiled softly, silently telling him yes. And then we surrendered, to the moment, to each other, to the fire that had been smoldering from the very first glance. Everything after that blurred together. Time slipped away, lost in heated touches, whispered breaths, and the quiet unraveling of restraint. And for the first time in years, I understood. This was what I had been waiting for.